In the middle of its song the king was about to uplift his scepter in sign of choice but checked himself and said, "But let us be sure. Bring back the thrush, let them sing together." The thrush was brought, and the two birds sang their songs together. The king thought, then his decision began to strengthen, one could see it in his face. Hope returned to the hearts of the old ministers, their pulses began to beat quicker, the scepter began to rise slowly, when there was a frightful interruption. It was a sound like this, just at the door, wah! He! Wah! He! Wahi! 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 Everybody was startled. The next moment the dearest, sweetest, prettiest little peasant girl of 9 years ran into the hall, her brown eyes glowing with childish eagerness, but when she saw that noble company and those angry faces she stopped and cried. Nobody gave her welcome, none pitied her. Then she looked up through her tears, and said, "My lord the king, I pray you pardon me, for I meant no wrong. I have no father and no mother, but I have a goat and a donkey, and they are all in all to me. My goat gives me the sweetest milk, and when the dear good donkey brays it seems to me there is no music like to it. So when my lord the king's jester said the sweetest singer among all the animals should save the crown and nation, and made me to bring here, all the court burst into a rude laugh, and the child went away crying, without trying to finish her speech. The chief minister had a private order that she and her donkey be driven out of the palace. Then the trial of the birds went on. The two birds sang their best, but the scepter lay motionless in the king's hand. Hope died slowly out in the breasts of all. An hour went by, 2 hours, still no decision. The waiting people outside the palace grew mad with anxiety. The twilight came on, the shadows fell deeper and deeper. The king and his court could no longer see each other's faces. No one spoke, none called for lights. The great trial had been made, it had failed, each and all wished to hide their faces from the light and cover up their deep trouble in their own hearts. Finally, hark! Rich, full sounds of the sweetest melody streamed forth from a far part of the hall, the nightingale's voice. "Up!" shouted the king, "let all the bells make proclamation to the people, for the choice is made and we have not erred. King, dynasty, and nation are saved. From this time on let the nightingale be honored throughout the land forever. And publish it among all the people that whosoever shall insult a nightingale, or injure it, shall suffer death. The king has spoken." All that little kingdom was drunk with joy. There were bonfires before the castle and in the city all night long, the people danced and drank and sang, and the triumphant clamor of the bells never ceased. From that day the nightingale was a sacred bird. Its song was heard in every house, the poets wrote its praises, the painters painted it, its sculptured image was everywhere on walls, arches and public buildings. It was even taken into the king's councils, and no important matter of the state was decided until the soothsayers had laid the thing before the state nightingale and translated to the ministry what it was that the bird had sung about it. The young king was fond of the chase. When the summer came he rode forth with hawk and hound, one day, in a brilliant company of the nobles. In a great forest he has lost them, then took what he imagined a near cut, to find them again, but it was a mistake. He rode on, hopefully at first, but with sinking courage finally. Twilight came on, and still he was in a lonely and unknown land. Then came a catastrophe. In the dim light he forced his horse through a thicket overhanging a deep and rocky valley. When horse and rider reached the bottom, the former had a broken neck and the latter a broken leg. The poor little king lay there suffering from pain, and each hour seemed a long month to him. He tried to hear any sound that might promise hope of rescue, but he heard no voice, no sound of horn or bay of hound. So at last he gave up all hope, and said, "Let death come." Just then the deep, sweet song of a nightingale reached his ear. "Saved!" The king said. "Saved! It is the sacred bird and the prophecy has come true. The gods themselves protected me from error in the choice." He could hardly contain his joy. Every few moments now he thought he heard the sound of approaching help. But each time it was a disappointment, no help came, only the sacred bird sang on. He began to think he had made a mistake about his choice. Toward dawn the bird ceases. The morning came, and with it thirst and hunger, but no help. The second day ended. At last the king cursed the nightingale. Immediately the song of the thrush came from out the wood. The king said in his heart, "This was the true bird, my choice was false, help will come now." But it did not come. Then he lay many hours insensible. When he came to himself, a linnet was singing. He listened, with apathy. His faith was gone. "These birds," he said, "can bring no help, I and my house and my people are doomed." He was grown weak from hunger and thirst and suffering, and felt that his end was near. In truth he wanted to die. For long hours he lay without thought or feeling or motion. Then his senses returned. The dawn of the third morning was breaking. Ah, the world seemed very beautiful to his worn eyes. Suddenly a great longing to live rose up in his lad's heart, and he wanted to see his home and his friends once more. In that moment a soft, faint, far-off sound, but oh, how sweet to his waiting ear, came out of the distance. Oh, that song is sweeter, 1,000 times sweeter than the voice of the nightingale, thrush, or linnet, for it brings not only hope, but real help in now. Indeed, my life, my house and my people are saved. The sacred singer has chosen itself. The ass shall be sacred from this day. The beautiful music grew nearer and nearer, stronger and stronger, and even sweeter and sweeter to the sufferer's ear. The little donkey appeared nearby, and when at last he saw the dead horse and the wounded king, he came and snuffed at them with simple curiosity. The king petted him, and he knelt down as he always did when his little mistress desired to mount. With great difficulty and pain the lad drew himself upon the creature's back. The ass went singing forth from the place and carried the king to the little peasant girl's hut. She made him a bed, gave him goat's milk, and then flew to tell the great news to the first party of searchers she might meet. The king got well. His first act was to proclaim the sacredness of the ass, his second was to add this particular ass to his cabinet and make him chief minister of the crown. His third was to have all the statues of nightingales throughout his kingdom destroyed, and replaced by statues of the sacred donkey, and his fourth was to announce that when the little peasant girl would reach her 15th year he would make her his queen, and he kept his word. Such is the legend. This explains why the image of the ass is everywhere on walls and arches, and it explains why, during many centuries, an ass was always the chief minister in the royal cabinet, just as is still the case in the most cabinets to this day, and it also explains why, in that little kingdom, during many centuries, all great poems, all great speeches, all great books, all public ceremonies and all royal proclamations always began with these exciting words. Will the reader cast his eye over the following verses, and see if he can discover anything harmful in them? Conductor, when you receive a fare, punch in the presence of the passenger. A blue trip slip for an 8-cent fare, a buff trip slip for a 6-cent fare, a pink trip slip for a 3-cent fare, punch in the presence of the passenger. Chorus punch, brothers. Punch with care. Punch in the presence of the passenger. I came across these rhymes in a newspaper, a little while ago, and read them a couple of times. They took instant and complete possession of me. All through breakfast they went waltzing through my brain, and when, at last, I finished, I could not tell whether I had eaten anything or not. I went to my room to write. I took up my pen, but all I could get it to say was, punch in the presence of the passenger. I fought hard for an hour, but it was useless. The day's work was ruined, I could see that clearly enough. I gave up and went downtown, and soon discovered that my feet were keeping time to those rhymes. When I could stand it no longer I stopped. But it did no good, those rhymes went on disturbing me just as before. I returned home, and suffered all the afternoon, suffered all through dinner, suffered, and cried, and jingled all through the evening, went to bed and jingled right along, the same as ever, got up at midnight frantic, and tried to read, but there was nothing visible upon the page except punch. Punch in the presence of the passenger. 2 days later, on Saturday morning, I arose and went to my friend, the Reverend Mr., to walk to the Talcott Tower, 10 miles distant. He stared at me, but asked no questions. We started. Mr. talked, as is his habit. I said nothing, I heard nothing. At the end of a mile, Mr. said, "Mark, are you sick?" I never saw a man look so worn and absent-minded. "Say something, do." Gloomily, without enthusiasm, I said, "Punch, brothers, punch with care. Punch in the presence of the passenger." My friend eyed me blankly, looked perplexed, then said, "Mark, there does not seem to be anything sad in what you have said, certainly nothing sad, and yet, maybe it was the way you said the words. I never heard anything that sounded so pathetic." "What is?" But I heard no more. I was already far away with my pitiless, heartbreaking blue trip slip for an 8-cent fare, buff trip slip for a 6-cent fare, pink trip slip for a 3-cent fare, punch in the presence of the passenger. I do not know what occurred during the other 9 miles. However, all of a sudden Mr. laid his hand on my shoulder and shouted, "Oh, wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Don't sleep all day. Here we are at the tower, man. I have talked myself deaf and dumb and blind, and never got an answer. Just look at this autumn landscape. Look at it. Look at it. What do you say to this?" I sighed and murmured, "A buff trip slip for a 6-cent fare, a pink trip slip for a 3-cent fare, punch in the presence of the passenger." Reverend Mr. stood there, very grave, then he said, "Mark, there is something about this that I cannot understand. Those are about the same words you said before, there does not seem to be anything in them, and yet they nearly break my heart when you say them. Punch in the, how is it they go?" I began at the beginning and repeated all the lines. My friend's face lighted with interest. He said, "Why, what a fascinating jingle it is. It is almost music. It flows along so nicely. I have nearly caught the rhymes myself. Say them over just once more, and then I'll have them, sure." I said them over. Then Mr. said them. He made one little mistake, which I corrected. The next time and the next he got them right. Now a great burden seemed to fall from my shoulders. that torturing jingle was forgotten and a grateful sense of rest and peace descended upon me. I was light-hearted enough to sing, and I did sing for half an hour, as we went homeward. Then my freed tongue found speech again, and I began talking. At last I said, "Haven't we had a good time? But now I remember, you haven't said a word for 2 hours. Come, out with something." The Reverend Mr. turned his eyes upon me, sighed and said, "Punch, brothers, punch with care. Punch in the presence of the passenger." A sudden pain shot through me as I said to myself, poor fellow, he has got it, now." I did not see Mr. for 2 or 3 days after that. Then, on Tuesday evening, he visited me. He was pale and worn. He lifted his eyes to my face and said, "Mark, those heartless rhymes have ridden me like a nightmare, day and night, hour after hour, to this very moment." Saturday evening I had a sudden call, by telegraph, and took the night train for Boston. The occasion was the death of an old friend who had requested that I should preach his funeral sermon. I took my seat in the car and began to think of the sermon. But I never got beyond the opening paragraph, for then the train started and the car wheels began their clack, 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 clack. Clack, 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 and right away those rhymes fitted themselves to that accompaniment. It lasted for an hour. It seemed to me that I must go mad if I sat there any longer, so I undressed and went to bed. But the thing went right along, just the same. Clack, 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 a blue trip slip, clack, 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 for an 8-cent fare, clack, 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 a buff trip slip, clack, 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 for a 6-cent fare, and so on, and so on, and so on. Punch, in the presence of the passenger. Sleep? Not a single wink. I was almost a lunatic when I got to Boston. Don't ask me about the funeral. I did the best I could, but all was in vain. The moment I had finished, I fled to the anteroom almost frenzy. I saw an aged maiden aunt of the dead man there, who had arrived from Springfield too late to get into the church. She began to sob, and said, "Oh, he is gone, and I didn't see him before he died." "Yes," I said, "he is gone, oh, will this suffering never cease? You loved him, then? Oh, you too loved him. Loved him. Loved who? Why, my poor George. My poor nephew. Oh, him. Yes, oh, yes, yes. Certainly, certainly. Punch, oh. This misery will kill me. Bless you. Bless you, sir, for those sweet words. Were you present during his last moments? Yes. whose last moments. His. My nephew's. Yes. Oh, yes, yes, yes. I suppose so, I think so, I don't know. Oh, certainly, I was there, I was there. Oh, what a privilege. What a privilege. And his last words, so, tell me his last words. What did he say? He said, oh, my head, my head, my head. He said, he never said anything but punch, punch, punch in the presence of the passenger. Oh, leave me, madam. In the name of all that is generous, leave me to my madness, my misery, my despair, a buff trip slip for a 6-cent fare, a pink trip slip for a 3-cent fare, punch in the presence of the passenger. My friend's hopeless eyes rested upon mine, then he said impressively, Mark, you do not say anything. You don't offer me any hope. But, me, it is just as well, it is just as well. You could not do me any good. The time has long gone by when words could comfort me. Something tells me that my tongue is doomed to repeat those jingles forever. There it is coming on me again, a blue trip slip for an 8-cent fare, a buff trip slip for a, thus murmuring the rhymes, my friend sank into a peaceful trance and forgot his suffering. How did I finally save him from the asylum? I took him to a neighboring university and he recited the rhymes into the ears of the poor unthinking students. How is it with them, now? The result is too sad to tell. Why did I write this article? It was for a noble purpose. It was to warn you, reader, if you should come across those merciless rhymes, to avoid them as you would a pestilence. Once I met a man in the street whom I had not seen for 6 or 7 years, and something like this talk followed. I said, but you used to look sad and old, you don't now. Where did you get all this youth and cheerfulness? Give me the address. He laughed, took off his shining hat, pointed to a pink circlet of paper there, with something lettered on it, and went on laughing while I read, J. B. Undertaker. Then he put his hat on, and cried out, that what's the matter? It used to be rough times with me when you knew me, insurance agency business, you know, very irregular. Big fire, all right, good trade for 10 days while people are frightened, after that dull policy business till next fire. But towns like this don't have fires often enough. I tell you, this is the business. People don't wait for example to die. No, sir, they die all the time, there aren't dull spots in the undertaker line. I just started in with 2 or 3 little old coffins and a hired hearse, and now look at the thing. I've worked up a business here that would satisfy any man, no matter who he is. 5 years ago I lived in a small room just under the roof. I live in a beautiful house now. Does a coffin pay so well? Is there much profit in a coffin? Oh. How you talk. Then, with a dropping of his voice and an impressive look, he said, "Look here, there's one thing in this world which isn't ever cheap. That's a coffin. There's one thing in this world about which a person doesn't say, 'I'll look around a little, and if I find I can't do better I'll come back and take it.' That's a coffin. There's one thing in this world which a person won't take in pine if he can go walnut, and won't take in walnut if he can go mahogany, and won't take in mahogany if he can go an iron casket with silver doorplate and bronze handles. That's a coffin. And there's one thing in this world which you don't have to worry around after a person to get him pay for. And that's a coffin. Undertaking? Why, it's the dead surest business in Christendom, and the nobliest. Why, just look at it. A rich man won't have anything but the very best, and you can give it to him. And now a poor man, and if you work him right he'll bust himself on a single layout. Or especially a woman. For instance, Mrs. O'Flaherty comes in, widow, wiping her eyes and moaning. She looks about and says, "And what might you ask for that one?" $39, madam, says I. It's a big price, sure, but Pat shall be buried like a gentleman, as he was, if I have to work me fingers off for it. I'll have that one, sir. Yes, madam, says I, and it is a very good one, too, not costly, to be sure, but in this life we must cut our garments to our cloth, as the saying is. And then I go on, this one with the white satin lining is a beauty, but I am afraid, well, $65 is a rather, but no matter, I felt obliged to say to Mrs. O'Shaughnessy "Do you mind to say that Bridget O'Shaughnessy bought her husband to that beautiful box to ship that drunken devil to hell in?" "Yes, madam." "Then Pat shall go to heaven in the twin to it, if it takes the last cent the O'Flahertys can get. And mind you, add some extras, too, and I'll give ye another $1. Of course I don't forget to mention that Mrs. O'Shaughnessy hired $54 worth hearse and then Mrs. O'Flaherty demands a better hearse. "Well," said I, "if you are so light-hearted and jolly in ordinary times, what must you be in an epidemic?" He shook his head. "No, you're wrong, there. We don't like to see an epidemic. An epidemic doesn't pay." "Well, of course, I don't mean that, exactly, but it doesn't pay in proportion to the regular thing. Doesn't it occur to you why?" "No." "Think." "I can't imagine." "What is it?" it's just two things. Well, what are they? One is embalming. And what's the other? Ice. How is that? Well, in ordinary times, a person dies, and we lay him up in ice, 1 day, 2 days, maybe 3, to wait for friends to come, takes a lot of it, melts quickly. We ask high prices for that ice. Well, don't you know, when there's an epidemic, they rush into the cemetery the minute the breath's out. No market for ice in an epidemic. Same with embalming. In ordinary times you take a family that's able to embalm, and you've got a soft thing. You can mention 16 different ways to do it, though there ain't only 1 or 2 ways, when you come down to the bottom facts of it, and they'll take the highest priced way, every time. It's human nature in grief. It doesn't reason, you see. All it wants is physical immortality for the dead person, and they're willing to pay for it. All you've got to do is to be calm and go to work, and in a couple of hours he is worth a cool 600, that's what he's worth. Well, don't you see, when there's an epidemic people don't wait to embalm? No, indeed, they don't, and it hurts the business like health, as we say, hurts it like hell. Health, see, our little joke in the trade. Well, I must be coming. Give me a call whenever you need any, I mean, when you're dying, sometime. And in this joyful high spirits, he ran away. I remember it so well. I remember it as if it were yesterday, the first time I ever stole a watermelon. Yes, the first time. At least, I think it was the first time or along about there. It was, must have been, about 1848, when I was 13 or 14 years old. I remember that watermelon well. I can almost taste it now. Yes, I stole it. Yet why use so cruel a word? It was the biggest of the watermelons on a farmer's wagon standing in the street in the old town of Hannibal, Missouri. While the farmer was busy with another customer, I withdrew this melon. Yes, I stole is too strong. I withdrew it. I retired it from circulation. And I myself retired with it. The place to which the watermelon and I retired was a lumber yard. I knew a nice quiet alley between the sweet-smelling planks, and to that spot I carried the melon. Looking at it for a few moments, I broke it open with a stone. It was green, impossibly, hopelessly green. I do not know why this fact affected me, but it did. It affected me deeply. It changed in me the moral values of the universe. I began to reflect. Now, reflection is the beginning of reform. There can be no reform without reflection. I asked myself how I should behave. What would conscience dictate? What should a high-minded young man do after retiring a green watermelon? What would George Washington do? Now was the time for all the lessons received at Sunday school to act. And they did act. The word that came to me was restitution. There lay the path of duty. I reasoned with myself. I labored. At last I made up my mind. I'll do it, said I. I'll take him back his old melon. Not many boys would have been heroic, would so clearly have seen the right and decided to do it. The moment I reached that resolution I felt a strange uplift. One always feels an uplift when he turns from wrong to righteousness. I arose, spiritually strengthened, renewed and refreshed, and in the strength of that refreshment carried back the watermelon, that is, I carried back what was left of it, and made him give me a ripe one. But I had a duty toward that farmer, as well as to myself. I told him he ought to be ashamed of himself giving his customers green melons. And he was ashamed. He said he was. He said he felt as badly about it as I did. In this he was mistaken. He hadn't eaten any of the melon. I told him that the single case was bad enough, but asked him to consider what would become of him if this should become a habit with him. I pictured his future. And I saved him. He thanked me and promised to do better. We must always labor thus with those who have taken the wrong road. Probably this was the farmer's first false step. He had not gone far, but he had put his foot on this road. Happily, at this moment a friend appeared, a friend who put out a helping hand and held him back. Others might have hesitated to speak to him of his mistake, but I didn't. And it is one of the gratifications of my life that I can look back on what I did for that man in his hour of need. The blessing came. He went home with a bright face to his wife, and I got a ripe melon. I trust it was with him as it was with me. Reform with me was no passing episode. It was permanent. Since that day I have never stolen a never stolen a green watermelon. It was night. Stillness reigned in the great old feudal castle of Klausenstein. The year 1222 was drawing to a close. Far away in the tallest of the castle's towers a single light glimmered. A secret council was being held there. The old lord of Klausenstein sat in a chair thinking. At last he said, "My daughter." A young man of noble presence, clad from head to heel in a knight's clothes, answered, "Speak, father." "My daughter, the time has come to the mystery that has puzzled all your young life." "No, then, that it had its birth in the matters which I shall now reveal. My brother Ulrich is the great Duke of Brandenburg. Our father, on his deathbed, decided that if no son were born to Ulrich, the succession should pass to my house, provided a son were born to me. And further, in case no son were born to either, but only daughters, then the succession should pass to Ulrich's or my daughter. And so I and my old wife here prayed for the birth of a son, but the prayer was vain. You were born to us. I was in despair. I saw the mighty prize slipping from my grasp. 5 years had Ulrich been married, and yet he had no children at all. I thought, all is not lost. A saving plan had shot through my brain. You were born at midnight. Only the doctor, the nurse, and 6 waiting women knew your sex. I hanged them all before an hour passed. Next morning all the barony went mad with happiness because a son was born to Klaugenstein, and heir to Brandenburg. And while the secret has been kept, your mother's own sister nursed you, and from that time forward we feared nothing. When you were 10 years old a daughter was born to Ulrich. We grieved, but hoped for good results from measles, or physicians, or other natural enemies of infancy, but were always disappointed. She lived, she grew strong. But it is nothing. We are safe. For, ha! Ha! Have we not a son? And is not our son, well-beloved Conrad, the future Duke? Now time has come to go to my brother Ulrich. The cares of state do tire him, therefore he wills that you shall come to him and be already Duke in act, though not yet in name. Your servants are ready. You must journey tonight. Now listen well. Remember every word I say. There is a law as old as Germany, that if any woman sit for a single instant in the great ducal chair before she has been absolutely crowned in presence of the people, she shall die. So remember my words. Pronounce your judgments from the Premier's chair, which stands at the foot of the throne. Do this until you are crowned and safe. The conversation ended. The tears of the gentle-natured girl could not move the old lord of Klaugenstein. And so, at last, with a heavy heart, she saw the castle gates close behind her, and found herself riding away in the darkness surrounded by her vassals and servants. The old baron sat silent for many minutes after his daughter's departure, and then he turned to his sad wife and said, "Dame, it is 3 months since I sent the handsome Count Detzin on his devilish mission to my brother's daughter Constance. If he fails we shall be not wholly safe, but if he succeeds our girl will be a duchess." 6 days after these events the brilliant capital of the Duchy of Brandenburg greeted Conrad, the young heir to the crown. The old duke's heart was full of happiness, for Conrad's handsome person had won his love at once. The great halls of the palace were crowded with nobles, who welcomed Conrad bravely, and so bright and happy did all things seem, that he felt his fears and sorrows passing away. But in a distant apartment of the palace a scene of a different nature was taking place. By a window stood the Duke's only child, the Lady Constance. Her eyes were red and swollen, and full of tears. She was alone. The villain Detson is gone, has fled the dukedom, she said aloud. I could not believe it at first, but, alas, it is too true. And I loved him so. I dared to love him though I knew the Duke, my father, would never let me marry him. I loved him, but now I hate him. With all my soul I hate him. Oh, what is to become of me? I am lost, lost, lost. I shall go mad. A few months passed. All men praised the young Conrad's government, and the old Duke soon gave everything into his hands. But, strangely enough, Conrad was not happy. For he saw that the Princess Constance had begun to love him. The love of the rest of the world was happy fortune for him, but this love was dangerous. And he saw, moreover, that the delighted Duke had discovered his daughter's passion and was already dreaming of a marriage. Every day the deep sadness that had been in the princess's face faded away, every day hope and animation shone brighter from her eye. Conrad was terrified. He bitterly cursed himself for having yielded to the instinct that had made him seek the companionship of one of his own sex when he was new and a stranger in the place, when he was sorrowful and needed sympathy. He now began to avoid his cousin. But this only made matters worse, for, naturally enough, the more he avoided her the more she came his way. The girl haunted him, she hunted him, she met him at all times and in all places, in the night as well as in the day. There was surely a mystery somewhere. This could not go on forever. All the world was talking about it. The Duke was beginning to look perplexed. Poor Conrad was becoming a ghost through fear and distress. One day as he was coming out from a private anteroom near the picture gallery, Constance confronted him, and seizing both his hands in hers, exclaimed, "Oh, why do you avoid me? What have I done, what have I said, to lose your kind opinion of me, for surely I had it once? Conrad, do not despise me, but pity a tortured heart. I cannot hold the words unspoken longer, or they will kill me. I love you, Conrad. There, despise me if you must." Conrad was speechless. Constance hesitated a moment, and then, misinterpreting his silence, she flung her arms about his neck and said, "You can love me, you will love me. Oh, say you will, my own, my worshipped Conrad." Conrad groaned aloud. He thrust the poor girl from him, and cried, "You know not what you say. It is forever and ever impossible." And then he fled like a criminal, leaving the princess in the gallery. A minute afterwards she was crying and sobbing there, and Conrad was crying and sobbing in his chamber. Both were in despair. By and by Constance rose slowly to her feet and moved away, saying, "He was despising my love at the very moment that I thought it was melting his cruel heart. I hate him. I hate him." Time passed on. Sadness rested once more upon the countenance of the good Duke's daughter. She and Conrad were seen together no more now. The Duke grieved at this. But as the weeks passed Conrad's color came to his cheeks, and his old-time liveliness to his eye, and he administered the government with wisdom. But soon a strange whisper began to be heard about the palace. It grew louder, it spread farther. The gossips of the city got hold of it. It swept the dukedom. And this is what the whisper said: "The Lady Constance has given birth to a child." When the Lord of Klaugenstein heard it he shouted, "Long live Duke Conrad! For so, his crown is sure from this day forward. Detzin has fulfilled his mission well, and he shall be rewarded." The time of the trial came. All the great lords and barons of Brandenburg were assembled in the Hall of Justice in the ducal palace. No space was left unoccupied where there was room for a spectator to stand or sit. Conrad, clad in purple and ermine, sat in the premier's chair, and on either side sat the great judges of the dukedom. The old duke had commanded that his daughter should be tried without any favor, and then had gone to his bed broken-hearted. His days were numbered. Poor Conrad had begged not to be made the judge of his cousin's crime, but in vain. The saddest heart in all that great assembly was in Conrad's breast. The gladdest was in his father's, for unknown to his daughter Conrad, the old Baron Klaugenstein had come, and was among the crowd of nobles. The Lord Chief Justice said, "Prisoner, stand forth." The unhappy princess rose, and stood before the great assembly. The Lord Chief Justice continued, "Most noble lady, before the great judges of this dukedom you have been accused and proved guilty of having given birth to a child out of holy wedlock, and by our ancient law the penalty for this crime is death. Now listen to this grace the acting Duke, our good Lord Conrad, who will pronounce his solemn sentence." Conrad stood up, looked at the princess, and the tears came into his eyes. He opened his lips to speak, but the Lord Chief Justice said quickly, "Not there, Your Grace, not there. It is not lawful to pronounce judgment upon any of the ducal family except from the ducal throne." A shudder went to the heart of poor Conrad. He had not been crowned. He hesitated and turned pale with fear. But it must be done. Wondering eyes were already upon him. They would be suspicious eyes if he hesitated longer. He ascended the throne and said, "Prisoner, in the name of our sovereign Lord Ulrich, Duke of Brandenburg, listen to what I am going to say. By the ancient law of the land, unless you name the partner of your guilt, you must surely die. Take this opportunity, save yourself while yet you may. Name the father of your child." Silence fell upon the great court, a silence so deep that men could hear their own hearts beat. Then the princess slowly turned, with eyes gleaming with hate, and pointing her finger straight at Conrad, said, "You are the man."